everybody, and welcome to the Paranormal Portal. I'm your host, Brent Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got an epic show ahead, but just remember, if any of you have experiences you'd like to share, I'd love to hear from you. You can either email me at paranormalportalradio@gmail.com or head over to paranormalportal.net and scroll down and find the button that says Interview Me, and that'll allow you to look at a calendar of possible times and dates and find a date that works for you. Love to hear your stories, so definitely get in touch with me. It was late summer, mid-1990s, and this happened just outside a small farming town in central Illinois. The kind of place where it gets quiet fast after dark. No streetlights once you're a few minutes outside of town. Just fields, tree lines, and long stretches of road that feel empty, even during the day. The witness was a man in his early 40s at the time, married, 2 kids, worked construction. Not someone who followed UFO stories or paranormal stuff. He wasn't looking for anything unusual that night. He was just driving home. It was around 10:30, maybe even closer to 11. He'd taken a back road he used all the time. Cornfields on both sides, windows down a bit. The AM radio was on low. About a mile ahead of him, he noticed a glow over the field to the right. It wasn't a beam or a spotlight, just a steady glow, sitting low over the field. At first, he thought it might be a combine or some kind of farm equipment running late. That really wasn't unusual during harvest season, but as he got closer, the light didn't move, and it wasn't even the right color. Too white, far too clean. Well, he slowed down, and then he realized the glow wasn't coming from the ground. It was hovering just above it. He pulled over onto the shoulder and shut the engine off. No reason he could explain, he just did. He stepped out of the truck and stood there with the door open, one hand still resting on it, like he hadn't fully committed to stopping yet. Well, the object was maybe 200 feet away, sitting in the field. Disc-shaped, no windows, no markings. About the size of a small house. It wasn't floating high above the ground. It looked like it was just resting there, barely off the ground, as if it had settled down instead of landed. And then he noticed some movement. There were 3 figures near the underside of the craft. At first, he thought they were people. That's the brain trying to help, trying to keep things normal. But the longer he watched, the harder that was to maintain. They were roughly human-shaped, 2 arms, 2 legs, a body, a head, about 4 to 5 feet tall, but their movements were off. Not fluid, but not stiff either. More like deliberate and purposeful. Each motion looked planned, like they were following steps. They didn't talk to each other. There were no gestures and no apparent urgency. They just worked. One of them moved along the lower edge of the craft, stopping at intervals, placing its hands against the surface for a few seconds and then moving on. Another stood slightly back, facing the field, almost like it was keeping watch, though it never actually turned its head. The third went in and out of a darker opening beneath the craft. There was no ramp, no ladder, just inside then outside again. The witness realized something then that made his stomach drop. They hadn't even noticed him yet. He was standing there in the open, no cover, no trees, just close by, just a man, a truck, and a dark road. And the only sound was the insects. No hum, no engine noise, no wind even from the object, just silence. He became very aware of his own breathing, how loud it felt, how out of place he was in that moment. And then one of them, that had been facing the field, stopped. Slowly, it turned its head and looked directly at him. Well, there was no expression, there was no reaction, just seemingly a recognition. And in that instant, the witness knew whatever these things were doing, it wasn't for him. He wasn't part of the plan. He was an interruption. And that's when he got back in the truck. He didn't slam the door, didn't start the engine right away. He eased back like any sudden movement might matter. And he didn't know why he thought that, but he did. When he finally drove away, he didn't even look back in the mirror. He said later the most unsettling part wasn't fear. It was the feeling that he'd walked into the middle of something already in progress and left before it was finished. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you already know there's a wide range of experiences that get lumped together under the UFO umbrella. Some of them are dramatic, some are deeply personal, and some of them don't fit neatly into any category at all. Tonight, we're staying in a very specific lane. We're not talking about abductions. We're not talking about missing time, medical procedures, or people being taken from their homes. Those stories are real, and there's no shortage of them. But each one really warrants a careful discussion in its own right. What we're focusing on here are encounters where people say they've come across something already on the ground or just above it. Craft that appears to have landed and beings nearby. Sometimes moving around the craft, sometimes working, sometimes they're just there. In many of these cases, the witnesses weren't approached, they weren't chased, they weren't taken. They were simply close enough to watch, and in some moments, close enough to be noticed. And that detail matters. Because when you strip away the more extreme elements, what you're left with are questions that are harder to brush off. Why land at all? Why do it in open fields along back roads or near small towns? Why allow yourself to be seen, even briefly? And why do so many of these witnesses describe the beings themselves in similar ways? Not emotional, not curious, almost task-focused, like they were in the middle of something and didn't expect company. As we go through these accounts tonight, we'll spend time with those details. Where it happened, when it happened, what the person noticed before they realized it mattered. And after we've walked through several of these encounters, we'll talk about what they seem to have in common, and just as importantly, what they don't. Let's get into the next one. This one goes back to the spring of 1964, just outside the town of Sirocco, New Mexico. It was mid-afternoon, broad daylight, clear sky. The witness was a police officer named Lonnie Zamora. He was on duty, alone in his patrol car, chasing a speeding vehicle south of town. Nothing unusual about the day, just another shift. And then he heard a loud roar. He described it later as a deep mechanical sound. Not like an explosion, but strong enough that he thought something nearby had blown up. He saw a plume of blue and orange flame rise from behind a low ridge in the desert. Well, Zamora broke off the chase and headed towards it. As he crested the rise, he saw something sitting in a shallow, dried-out creek cut in the desert floor about 100 yards away. At first, he thought it might be an overturned car or some kind of small aircraft. That's what made sense at the moment. But as he drove closer, that explanation just fell apart. The object was oval-shaped, smooth, metallic, no wings, no rotors, no tail. It looked too clean, too deliberate, and it was resting on short legs, like it had been set down there. Then he noticed two figures standing beside it. They were small, about the size of children, dressed in light-colored suits. They didn't look panicked. They didn't look surprised to be there. They just looked busy. Zamora stopped the car and stepped out, keeping the door open behind him. He called out, thinking maybe it was some kind of experimental aircraft, and the people were injured. Well, the figures reacted immediately. They turned towards the craft and moved quickly, not running, but fast enough that it caught his attention. Within seconds, they were gone from sight, either behind the object or inside of it. Well, Zamora took a few cautious steps towards it, and then he said the air felt hot. The ground beneath the object looked scorched, like something intense had been sitting there recently. And there was no smell of fuel, there was no debris. Then the roar came back. A loud rising sound accompanied by a blast of flame shooting downward from beneath the craft. The object lifted straight up, wobbling slightly, and then it shot off at an angle and disappeared over the desert. Zamora dove backward towards his patrol car, convinced that it was going to explode. Well, it didn't. And when backup arrived minutes later, they found physical evidence exactly where Zamora said it would be. Burn marks in the soil, impressions left by landing legs, small footprints nearby that didn't match any known work boots or shoes. Air Force investigators were called in, and so were scientists. The case was taken seriously. Not because what Zamora believed, but because of who he was and what was found at the scene. Zamora never tried to profit from the story. He didn't go on lecture circuits. He avoided talking about it whenever he could. He said the experience left him shaken, but more than that, confused. Because whatever he saw that day wasn't trying to hide. It landed in open terrain in daylight near a town, and only reacted when it realized that it had been noticed. What makes the Sirocco encounter stand out is how public it was. Daylight, open terrain, and a trained observer. But that same kind of encounter shows up again in much quieter places, far from patrol cars and paved roads. One of those happened the following year in a rural farming area in southern France, just before sunrise. And this one happened in the early morning, summer of 1965, in a rural farming area near the village of Valençol in southern France. The witness was a man named Maurice Massey, and he was a lavender farmer. Quiet life, early mornings, same routine every day. Just before dawn, a little after 5 a.m., he was walking out towards his fields when he heard a strange whistling sound. Well, at first, he thought it might be a helicopter. There was a military base not too far away, and aircraft weren't unheard of. But the sound didn't move. It stayed fixed. Well, as he got closer to his lavender rows, he saw something sitting on the ground about 100 feet away. It wasn't large, roughly about the size of a small car. Oval-shaped, resting directly on the soil, not floating. The surface looked smooth and dull, almost gray. And standing beside it were two figures. They were short, around 4 feet tall, broad through the chest, and their heads seemed large in proportion to their bodies, with slanted eyes that caught the light. They were dressed in what looked like dark gray suits, tight-fitting with no visible seams or fasteners. Massey stopped where he was. He said his first thought wasn't fear. It was just confusion. He assumed they were people, maybe even pilots, maybe part of some strange military exercise. He called out to them in French. They turned towards him at the same time. One of them raised a small device. Massey described it as a tube-like device, about the size of a pencil, and they pointed it in his direction. Instantly, his body locked up. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even turn his head. He said it felt like his muscles had simply shut off, like someone had just flipped a switch. The two figures watched him for a moment and then turned back towards their craft. One of them touched the surface and an opening appeared. Not a door swinging open, but a section of the craft that just seemed to fold inward. They stepped inside and the opening closed. Then the object lifted straight up without any sound, rose a short distance and shot away at an angle so fast that Massey said it vanished in mere seconds. When the paralysis released, he collapsed to the ground. Later that day, investigators found physical traces in the field, impressions in the soil where the craft had been sitting. The lavender plants around the area were damaged, and in the weeks that followed, they began to wither and die in a way that local experts couldn't easily explain. Massey himself reported lingering effects. He complained of headaches and fatigue for years afterwards. His weight dropped dramatically. Doctors couldn't find a clear medical cause. Like many witnesses, he didn't seek attention. He gave his statement when asked, and then he went back to his life. He said the worst part wasn't being frozen in place. It was just how casually it all happened. There was no warning, no communication, no concern for him beyond stopping him from interfering. Just a task completed, and then they were gone. The Valençol incident was over in moments, but it left behind physical traces and long-term effects that never fully went away. In another case, just a couple of years later, a man came even closer, close enough to feel the heat from the craft itself. That encounter happened in a remote wooded area near Falcon Lake in Manitoba, Canada. It was May of 1967 in a remote area near Falcon Lake in Manitoba, Canada. The witness was a man named Stefan Michalak, and he was an industrial mechanic by trade and an amateur prospector. He liked to spend his free time out in the woods looking for quartz and other minerals. It was something he'd done for years. That afternoon, he was alone, hiking through a rocky area a few miles from the nearest road. The weather was clear, quiet, and there was no wind. Around noon, he heard the sound of geese taking off suddenly from a nearby lake. Almost at the same time, he noticed two cigar-shaped objects descending through the sky. One stayed higher up, and the other dropped fast and came down into a clearing not far from where he was standing. He made his way towards it, assuming it was some kind of experimental aircraft. The object was metallic, silvery, about 35 feet long, shaped like a flattened oval. It was resting on the ground, tilted slightly to one side, and it was hot. He could feel the heat radiating off of it as he approached. He said it reminded him of standing near an industrial furnace. On the side of the object there was an open hatch. Inside he could see bright lights and hear voices. At first he thought the voices were human. He called out in English, no response. Then in Polish, still nothing. Well, finally he tried Russian, thinking it might be Soviet aircraft. And that's when the voices stopped. Moments later, the hatch closed. Michalak stepped closer, trying to get a better look at the markings on the side of the craft. He said they looked like symbols, not letters, arranged in a row. And he took out his glove to touch the surface, and immediately felt a blast of hot gas striking his chest. He was thrown backwards. The craft began to lift, rising just a few feet off the ground. A grid of small holes on its underside suddenly glowed red, and superheated gas poured out of them. Michalak's shirt caught fire. The object shot upward and disappeared, leaving him burned and disoriented. He managed to make his way back towards the road, stopping several times to rest. When he was finally found, he was sick, vomiting and clearly burned. The pattern of burns on his chest matched the grid holes he described beneath the craft. Doctors treated him for weeks. The burns were real. The symptoms were real. Investigators later found a circular area at the site where vegetation had been flattened and scorched. Soil samples showed unusual changes consistent with extreme heat. Michalak never claimed that he was taken. He never claimed the beings interacted with him directly. In fact, he said he never clearly saw anyone outside the craft. What unsettled him the most was how close he got. Close enough to hear voices. Close enough to feel the heat. Close enough to be injured without ever being acknowledged. Like the craft was there to do something specific, and he was never meant to be a part of it. When you think back over these encounters, what's striking isn't just what happened. It's when it happened in relation to the people who were there. In every case, the witnesses didn't arrive at the beginning of the story. They stepped into something that was already underway. Zamora crested that ridge and found figures moving around a craft, like they had reason to be there. Massey walked into his field expecting another normal morning and instead found two beings already standing beside an object on the ground. Michalak followed sound and movement into the woods and came face to face with something so hot he could feel it before he fully understood what he was even looking at. None of them were summoned. None of them were invited. They were observers by accident. And what's interesting is how little the presence of a human seemed to matter, at least at first. In Socorro, the figures kept working until they realized that they'd been seen. In Valansol, the reaction was immediate and efficient, like dealing with an interruption. And in Falcon Lake, Michalak's concern, his attempts to speak, to help, didn't even change the outcome at all. The events didn't stop because a person was nearby. They adjusted, and they continued on their way. So instead of stepping away from these moments, it might be worth stepping back into them and standing where those witnesses stood and paying attention to what the phenomena itself was doing. Not what it meant, not what it wanted, just what it did and how it behaved when someone wandered too close. Go back to Falcon Lake for a moment. Not to the takeoff and not to the burns, but to the seconds before any of that happened. Michalak didn't stumble onto the craft in a panic. He didn't hide and he didn't run. When he realized there might be people inside, his reaction was almost instinctive. He called out, first in English, then in Polish, and then in Russian. That detail matters. He was trying to make contact the only way he knew how. He was thinking like a person who believed other people might need help. Someone who assumes shares rules, shares concern. And for a brief moment, it almost feels like it might work. He hears voices. He's close enough to feel the heat coming off the metal. He's right there. But then the voices stop. The opening closes, and the craft leaves without any attempt to move away from him, without warning, without acknowledgement that he's even standing there. The result isn't just startling, it's careless. He's injured not because he approached too aggressively, but because his presence simply didn't factor into whatever decision was made next. That same kind of indifference shows up in other encounters too. In Socorro, the figures don't react when Zamora first appears. They don't scatter, they don't rush. They just keep doing what they're doing, and it's only when one of them notices him that anything changes. And even then, the response is brief. Finish up. Leave. In Valensoul, Massey doesn't get a warning or a gesture to back away. He doesn't get shouted at or waved off. He's immobilized. Not out of anger or panic, but efficiency, like dealing with something in the way. And once that problem is solved, the encounter ends. What's unsettling about all of this isn't hostility. It's the lack of it. There's no sense of confrontation, no curiosity, no effort to communicate beyond what's absolutely necessary to continue whatever the task is already underway. It raises an uncomfortable thought. Not that we're being watched, not that we're being studied, but that in these moments at least, we barely register at all. Almost the way you'd wave away a fly that wandered too close while you were in the middle of a dinner. Not because you hate it, not because you're afraid of it, but because it's irrelevant to what you're doing. And once it's gone, you go right back to your meal. There's another detail that keeps coming up in these encounters once you stop looking at them as isolated events. In every case, the activity was already underway before a human being showed up. Go back to Socorro. Zamora didn't arrive to see a craft landing. He didn't watch anything descend from the sky. He crested that ridge and found something already there, sitting on the ground, with figures moving around it like they'd been there for a while. One of them was tracing along the side of the craft, stopping at intervals, placing its hand against the surface. Another stood back, facing the open field, not scanning the sky and not reacting to anything, just positioned there. The third moved in and out of the opening beneath the craft. It didn't look like arrival, it looked like maintenance. Valensoul feels the same way. Massey didn't stumble onto a dramatic moment or a chaotic scene. The object was already sitting in his field. The two figures weren't startled. They weren't rushing, and they weren't looking around like they'd been caught off guard. They were just there. Whatever they were doing appeared routine enough that Massey's sudden appearance didn't change their behavior. At least not right away. The response wasn't emotional or panicked. It was immediate and controlled. Like dealing with something that shouldn't be there. And then there's Falcon Lake. Michalak didn't interrupt a landing. He followed sound and movement into the woods and came upon a craft already resting in a clearing, hot enough that he could feel it from several feet away. From where he stood, he could hear voices coming from inside. At first, he assumed they were human. Called out in English, nothing changed. Polish, nothing. It wasn't until Russian that the voices stopped, and that moment matters. For several seconds, his presence, his voice, didn't seem to register at all. The activity inside the craft continued uninterrupted. But then something shifted. The voices cut off, the opening closed, and the situation moved immediately to its next phase. Whether it was the language itself, the realization that something was closer than expected, or simply the final moment in whatever was already underway, there's just no way to know. But what's clear is that the response didn't come from curiosity or engagement. It, again, came from interruption. Not a conversation, not an exchange, just a decision to end that moment and leave. In none of these cases does it feel like the presence of a human initiates anything meaningful. There's no sign that the encounter itself is the point. There's no sense that the witness is being studied, examined, or engaged whatsoever. The people don't arrive at the center of the event. They arrive at the edge of it. And the behavior stays consistent across different places, different years, and different cultures. Whatever was happening didn't begin with the witness, and it didn't end because of them either. It's a strange thing to sit with, because it suggests that these moments aren't visits in the way we usually think of visits. They don't feel like check-ins or flyovers or demonstrations. Again, they feel like interruptions. Someone walking into a workspace they didn't know existed, catching a glimpse of something mid-task, and then being left behind once the work continues somewhere else. Once you start thinking of these encounters as interruptions rather than visits, another question naturally follows. Why land at all? If the goal was simply observation, there are easier ways to do that. Staying at a distance, remaining unseen, watching from above. None of these cases required the craft to be on the ground, and yet that's exactly where they were found. Go back to the settings. Socorro wasn't a deep wilderness, it was open desert, not even far from the town. A place where someone could stumble across the scene by accident, which is exactly what happened. Valensole wasn't hidden terrain. It was a working farm, a place tied to routine and repetition. Early mornings, familiar paths, the kind of environment where someone shows up at the same time every day. Falcon Lake was remote, but not inaccessible. Michalak didn't trespass or push past barriers. He followed sound and movement into a clearing that was already there. None of these locations feel random. They feel chosen, not for secrecy, but for practicality. Flat ground, open space, minimal obstruction. Places where something could sit, cool, vents, open, close. Places where whatever was happening could be done without interference, most of the time. And when interference did happen, the response wasn't panic. It was like an adjustment. In Socorro, the figures finished what they were doing and left. In Valensole, Massey was immobilized just long enough to prevent disruption. In Falcon Lake, the moment the activity inside the craft reached a stopping point, the encounter ended. No escalation, no pursuit, no effort to correct the witness afterward. Just departure. That suggests something important. Landing doesn't seem to be about us. It doesn't feel like a demonstration or a test. There's no sense of, watch this, or look what we can do. If anything, the landings feel functional, like stopping somewhere because that's where the work has to happen. And when someone wanders too close, the priority isn't contact, it's continuation. Finish what needs to be finished. Remove the obstruction. Leave. Seen that way, the landing isn't the event. It's the background. The real event, whatever it is, appears to be something else entirely, something brief, something specific, something that doesn't revolve around the people who happen to witness it, which may be the most unsettling part of all. Not that these things come down here, but that when they do, we're not the reason they came. There's one more thing that becomes noticeable when you stay within these kind of encounters. Not what happens, but where things stop. In each of these moments, there are points where the situation could have gone further, where the witness could have been chased, detained, or pulled deeper into the experience. And in these cases, that line is not crossed. Go back to Socorro. Zamora was alone, out in the open with no real protection. If anything were going to escalate, it easily could have happened there. Instead, the craft lifted off and just disappeared. No pursuit, no attempt to stop him from leaving, no effort to manage what he'd just seen. Valençol follows a similar pattern. Massey was immobilized instantly. Whatever caused it worked completely. If control had been the goal, it was already in place. But once the craft left, that control ended. There was no attempt to move him, no follow-up, no further engagement. And even at Falcon Lake, where Michalak was clearly injured, the harm doesn't feel like the point of the encounter. He wasn't approached or interacted with directly. He was simply too close when something powerful happened. Once the craft was gone, the moment was over. In this category of encounters, the witness is left behind. Not reassured, not informed, not removed from the story. Just left to deal with what they experienced. That doesn't mean escalation never happens elsewhere. It doesn't rule out other kinds of encounters entirely. But within these moments, landed craft work already underway, humans arriving by chance, there seems to be a consistent boundary. The activity ends, the craft leaves, and whatever happens next is left to the witness alone. Those limits don't explain the phenomena, but they do outline it. Not by what it does everywhere, but by how far it goes here and no further. There's a common moment that comes after each of these encounters, and it doesn't get talked about very often. It's the moment after. Zamora's left standing in the desert watching dust settle where something had just been. The sound is gone, the heat is gone, and the world snaps back into place like nothing unusual ever happened. Massey's left in his field as the sun finishes coming up. The craft is gone, the beings are gone, and the morning routine he's followed for years suddenly feels unfamiliar. Michalak is left in the woods, burned, sick, and confused, walking back towards a road that hasn't changed at all, even though everything he just experienced has. In each case, the witnesses don't leave with answers, they leave with a memory. They leave knowing they were close enough to something to be affected by it, but not close enough to understand it. And maybe that's the detail that lingers the longest. It isn't the craft that stays with them. It isn't the beings. It's the feeling of having stepped briefly into the middle of something that was not meant for them. Something that continued on its way once they were no longer a part of it. No explanations, no meaning, no closure. Just the quiet realization that the world they thought they understood had for a moment overlapped with something else and then pulled apart again. Those places still exist. Those roads, fields, and clearings are still there. People walk through them every day without noticing anything at all. which makes you wonder how many times moments like these begin and end without ever being seen, and how thin the distance really is between the ordinary and whatever lies just beyond it. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to leave you with one more story, one that fits right alongside the others we've talked about tonight. It's another moment where someone simply found themselves too close to something that was already happening. This one takes us back to England, to a quiet stretch of countryside near Suffolk in December of 1980. Late one night near the edge of Rendlesham Forest, U.S. Air Force personnel stationed at a nearby base were responding to reports of strange lights moving through the trees. At first it was brushed off as something ordinary, maybe a downed aircraft, maybe flares. But a small group was sent out to check it anyway. As they moved into the forest, the lights didn't disappear. They seemed to hold their position deeper among the trees, just out of sight. Following them led the group into a clearing, and that's where they found it. A metallic object resting on the ground. It wasn't large, triangular in shape, roughly the size of a small vehicle. The surface was smooth and dark, almost reflective, with the strange symbols etched along one side. The object in question was resting on the ground when they arrived. The men approached carefully, unsure of what they were looking at. There was no sound coming from the object. There was no visible movement, no heat that they could feel from where they stood. One of them moved closer than the others, and as he did, the object responded. Not suddenly, not even aggressively, but lights along its surface began to glow, shifting in color, and then without warning, it lifted off the ground, maneuvered between the trees with precision, and then moved away, disappearing into the night. No one was chased, no one was addressed, no one was acknowledged. The encounter ended almost as quietly as it began. When investigators returned to the clearing later, they found physical traces, impressions in the ground where the object had rested, broken branches, and radiation readings that were higher than normal for the area. Like the other stories we've talked about, the witnesses don't arrive at the beginning of the event. They arrive in the middle of it. And once their presence was registered, the response wasn't curiosity or confrontation. It was departure. Whatever the object was doing in that forest, it didn't appear to be there for them. They just simply crossed its path. Different country, different year, different people, but the same pattern. A craft on the ground, activity already underway, a human presence that changes very little. The moment ends, the place returns to normal, and the people involved are left with the same unanswered questions. Not what they saw, but why they were ever close enough to see it at all. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up for us today. So hope you guys enjoyed the show, and thank you again so much for all your love and support. And remember, if you want to follow the Paranormal Portal, probably the easiest way is to head over to paranormalportal.net. And that's the homepage for the Paranormal Portal. And you'll find links to all of our different social media and sites and information about the shows, including our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/paranormalportal. Or just look for Paranormal Portal on Google or whatever search engine, and you'll find links to our social media such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. So we're kind of all over the place, and we're spreading as well as we can. But anyway, thank you so much for the love and support. Y'all take care, and remember, we love y'all. Be good, be kind, be nice. Take care of each other, help each other out, find the magic in every day, and remember to laugh as much as you can. Until next time.